Well, hello. Today I'm so thrilled that I get a chance to speak with Tim Nelson. Tim is the co founder and CEO of Hope for Justice and the Slave Free Alliance, and his work is at the forefront of the global fight against one of humanity's most devastating injustices, child trafficking. Thank you so much, Tim, for taking time in your crazy schedule for all of this. I know you make your way around the globe a lot, so really appreciate stopping in.
No, it's really, really brilliant to be here and so grateful to come on the call with you.
Well, before we get started, a little context for our listeners. This interview is part of a celebration of my great grandmother, Eleanor Roosevelt, and her passion and commitment for human rights. At the end of every year, the Eleanor Roosevelt Center celebrates the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in different ways acknowledges the incredible impact of this document in both in shaping the foundation of modern human rights law since its adoption on the 10th of December 1948, but also inspiring movements and all of the work that we'll hear about from Tim. The values of freedom and dignity, bodily security, equality, they are just at the heart of the UDHR, and they defined the groundwork for our moral, legal obligations to prohibit, prevent, and punish all forms of slavery and human trafficking. But as we know, and as we'll hear more about, modern slavery persists at a scale that just defies comprehension. The stat I read was 50 million people trapped right now, forced to work, trapped in exploitative relationships, sold for sex, even forced into marriage against their will. It's a crisis that has no borders, touches every corner of the globe. And Tim's work and Tim's organization, Hope for Justice, it's in the trenches fighting. So welcome, Tim.
Thank you so much. And you captured the essence so well of your great grandmother and kind of the space that she held so highly and fought for so greatly. We have a lot to be thankful for and grateful for in her legacy.
Yeah, it just was such was so core to her as a human being, as well as all of the work that we celebrate in the UDHR. So maybe we just jump in at the deep end, and maybe you can just start telling a little about, what does slavery look like in the world today? Would be super helpful.
Yeah, you touched on it in terms of the size and scale, but it's estimated to be the second biggest crime globally after drug trafficking. And, when we think of serious and organized crime across the world, when they sell a kilo of cocaine, they only get to sell that once. But for a person who's found in slavery, they get to sell them time and time again. And at this moment in time, we see the real definition of what modern day slavery is captured by the Palermo Protocol. And that was created in 2000 and enacted in 2003. And it effectively talks about the act, the means, and the purpose of what slavery is. But we see that slavery is broken into 5 core parts. Predominantly, where people are most aware of it is around sexual exploitation, where women are, majoritively women are taken and forced to be sold for sex, predominantly in brothels. We see it around domestic servitude, where individuals are held in homes against their will for many, many years, forced to do manual labor, looking after children, looking after household tasks. This sometimes can be seen as the, softer side of modern day slavery. But for what we see across the board, it can be a combination of sex trafficking and labor trafficking together. But also it is a kind of basis for us to be able to understand how difficult it is for some people. Our longest served victim that we were able to rescue from this was held for 39 years in Los Angeles. And she spoke a rare form of Filipino, presented herself at a hospital for a nurse that we trained. And she was able to find freedom the next day because that nurse had had effective training. But 39 years is a brutal amount of time for anyone to be held and in something like domestic servitude. And the third area that we see internationally of the 5 core areas of modern day slavery is around labor exploitation. And it is the biggest one that we see internationally. Of the estimated nearly 50 million people who are enslaved, the estimates are that somewhere in the region of 27 million of them are within manufacturing settings, in agricultural settings, in workplace settings, where they're working in what we would know as labor exploitation and labor trafficking. The fourth one is where we see forced marriage. That happens in communities where culturally it is seen as okay. Quite often that can be in areas where, from a community perspective, a faith-based perspective, they believe it's okay for children to get married. And then the fifth area we see is around organ harvesting. And that is where individuals are trafficked predominantly so that their organs can be taken. And it tends to, for places like the US, it tends to only show up when someone arrives into the US and they hadn't realized they'd traveled to a foreign country for some cosmetic surgery and they'd been put under an anesthetic and didn't realize, and somebody took an organ that they didn't even realize in that process. So those are the 5 that it's known as. And to put that in context, it's more people now than at any point in time in human history. It's estimated now at this moment in time, more people are held in what is commonly known as modern day slavery. We really feel that slavery didn't just end in William Wilberforce's day. It's just adapted and become something different. And that's not to undermine or trivialize anything that anyone who was involved in the transatlantic slave trade has been through, that the impact of their families that they've felt since. But it is to show the size and scale and problem that we're seeing across the world.
Wow, those are just mind-boggling numbers. Just incredible. So when I think about this problem as a lay person, not in the midst of it, it just seems so hard to get at. It operates in the shadows, in hidden supply chains, in factories, as you said, forced labor behind closed doors. I mean, how do you tackle it? I would love just to hear a little bit more about what Hope for Justice does, what you found works.
Yeah, so it's really difficult because it's hidden in plain sight and it's an uncomfortable truth. If we think in America at the moment, 1 in 10 men will use a prostitute. And from that perspective, it creates a demand that there isn't the supply of girls who want to go into prostitution have been able to make happen. So I think the challenge that I see across the board is that the scale of this problem needs a really thought through professional approach to address it. We see in supply chains across the world the endemic nature of how some products and services are aligned completely to modern day slavery. Just to give you a couple of contexts before I go into Hope for Justice is, you take something like the shimmer effect of makeup, which is also the same product that is used in creating the pearlescent effect on car paint that we see outside of every vehicle that we would have. Or we see it in electric cabling insulation. The same product is used in all 3 circumstances in this product called mica. And mica is mined in Madagascar and 2 regions of India. And it's mined primarily by 5 and 6-year-old children. But when you're buying the makeup or the car paint upgrade for your purchase or the electric cabling that you're having fitted and installed in your buildings, this isn't made known. And it's therefore, we've got a disconnect between the problem itself, the understanding of what the issue is, and the addressing of the problem. Because I think if most people were aware that the goods and services that they were buying were being made off the back of slave labor, they would ask different questions of the companies and they would hold those companies to a higher authority. And certainly from our perspective, what we've seen at Hope for Justice is there is a need to start at the very highest tier to work with governments and to work with businesses to call them to a higher level of understanding, awareness, and action. And it is in that thought process, because if you have someone who's aware of something, it doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to do something about it. So we start at the highest levels with regards to policy in countries. We meet with legislators and politicians. We talk to them about the difficulties of legislation that exists at the moment and how it's not common and how it doesn't necessarily work in action. And then we come along down the next level down, and for laws that have been put in place, we want to try and make sure that the police and law enforcement know what the issues are and know how to address this. And I think from our perspective, we've seen over the years through Hope for Justice a significant benefit by providing help and support and training to law enforcement. This last year, we will have trained all the drug enforcement agents across the United States. We're already hearing of cases that are being found, of children being found that have come across the southern border in the United States, and those individuals are finding freedom because a DEA agent who's had effective training is able to do something on this. We work in the United States in areas like prisons, where we want to identify the prisoners who themselves have been trafficked and didn't realize it. Or maybe they didn't address what that issue is, and that might be one of the issues within the overall crimes that have been committed. But because it's not being addressed, it leads to re-trafficking. So we come along through with a thought-through professional approach, not just to provide training, but also to provide an advocate support on an independent basis to try and work alongside those individuals. So when we started Hope for Justice, we set up our first investigative hub in the UK. And we took on the senior police officer for that area who had looked after 2.2 million people's policing. And he retires and comes to work for us, which gives us instant credibility. He assembles the best team he's worked with through his career. People who've gone out to be on the golf course post their career come back to be part of this A team. And like in our first year in that first hub that we set up, we rescued 110 victims. And 110 victims, the youngest victim was just 3 months old, trafficked for sexual exploitation. We uncovered a bed manufacturer that were making beds for two of the largest retailers in the UK that would be akin to Nordstrom and Target in the US. People that you would expect to be able to buy goods and services that wouldn't have been made through slave labor. But the second hub that we set up, which was the next one down the line, we had one case where we went to a church and we trained them and their food bank how to spot signs of what slavery was. And the next week they called us up with 2 victims. We developed the intelligence, and by the time it came to court, there were over 400 victims from one Polish trafficking gang. And that in itself shows the scale of how serious and organized crime is operating. So we want to try and help support the police. We're not there as competition or to make people look bad. We want to come alongside them. And we get in the US, we would employ former CIA, FBI guys that do undercover intelligence and finding victims. But that's appropriate in the US, but it's not necessarily as appropriate in some of the other countries that we work in, jurisdictions that we work. So in places like Ethiopia and Uganda, we see exploitation across the board. So many children that live on the streets and who might be the impact of poverty or the impact of running away from home or whatever may have happened for that space, they become vulnerable and then have an opportunity to be trafficked. And in places like Ethiopia, Uganda, we've got a thought-through professional approach to try and work with what we call lighthouses. And we came up with this concept because we wanted to create short-term transition centers. And a lighthouse, you instantly understand what I mean by a lighthouse because it's something that brings people safe to shore. When we set it up in Ethiopia, we didn't realize Ethiopia is a landlocked country and people don't understand necessarily the concept of lighthouses. But the concept itself, we try and run and embed into each one of the countries. And it enables us to take children from a place of exploitation and bring them back to families, or if their families have been complicit, to family-based care. So we try and pinpoint in every country where is the best place for us to be working and where is the biggest need. And through our theory of change, we create that kind of architectural plan that we drop into any country we're operating in. And where there is great responses to what is happening, we are able to step back and not replicate something that's already been provided. So in the UK, the Salvation Army would have the government contract for victim aftercare. And off the back of it, that means that they provide all the housing support. So there's not a need for us to go into housing support in the UK. And in the US, there's some great organizations that we partner with. So we want to be working together collaboratively, not working in competition against each other, because what we see is almost like a David and Goliath type fight, where we don't need any organization to be working against each other. We all actually need to be pulling in the same direction.
Fascinating. I think there's some interesting parallels that were running through my mind with my great grandmother's work. That she, similar to what you're describing, she was motivated by the human being. She was motivated by the story and the life experience of individuals, but she had this sort of bridge back of her political acumen into policies, into what needed to be done and I guess what needed to be done on both the community level, closer to the people, but also at the very highest levels of government and politics, which is a bit like you're describing, which just makes so much sense. And I love your description of, you know, what are the cues you look for if you're a nurse, if you're a if you're in a position to be to sort of have your radar out. I think so many of us we don't have that radar. Like I don't think I would know what signs to look for. But I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to the people side, and that and in that, how do you work with survivors? I mean, it must just be incredible work, but so different given the different types of trafficking you've mentioned. What do they need immediately? What do they need? I mean, you've mentioned housing, but I would just love to hear a little bit more about how you support the survivors.
Yeah, so we're constantly trying to understand that trying to support survivors has to be done from a perspective of the personal circumstances that they're in. Every single one of their stories is unique. They may have common patterns of behavior. Quite often we see that the pattern is that you have a vulnerability that meets a promise, and then individuals are being tricked. And that in itself tells you a little bit of the problem. So the underlying vulnerability itself is the reason why people were able to manipulate and trick these people, because quite often they don't use padlocks and chains. They're behind closed doors, but people will always ask the question, well, why don't they run away? Why aren't they, wanting to be free? And we see people being used, manipulation, coercion, mental treatment that they put people under. If I give you some recent case where we had a trafficking victim where they were brought recent pictures of their family, and in a sexual exploitation perspective told, if you run away, we'll just kill your parents. And here's a recent photograph of your family to show you that we know exactly where they are and how to get to them. And for a trafficking victim, what they're then faced with is the torment that I'm going through less than the potential harm that if I run away. And a case that we had in that first year that we set up, we had a chap called Janos, and he was running a bed manufacturer, and he would literally bring 6 of those individual victims together, and he would look to hang one of them in front of the other 5. And when they're writhing and about to choke to death, one of the henchmen would cut them down. He would have a picture on the wall with him and the chief of police in the local area that he was in, as if to say, I am beyond approach. No one is going to approach. No one's going to come after me. No one's going to stop me from happening. And if you've got that level of brutality and harm, what you have to be able to do is you have to be willing to walk a journey with people. Quite often we talk about rescue not being an event, it's a process. And in that process, you want to try and make sure that you do the job properly. We see sensational videos that talk about traffic victims being helicoptered out of really war-torn scenarios where they find themselves in. For the large part, that is a false impression of traffic victims. Most of the victims know their trafficker. And somewhere in the region of 95% of all the cases coming through at the moment in the US, children have been groomed online first. In Texas alone last year, every single victim that came through the foster care system. So if you start to understand the routes in which the on-ramps, as you would say in the US, that people would come into this, our team have to be able to address the on-ramps as well as building a bridge of trust so that potential survivor, the victim as they are at the moment, would see that the world I could enter by partnering with Hope for Justice would be better. So our teams go into communities and they build bridges of trust. So we have community support workers, and those individuals would look to go out and talk about the issue. And sometimes people don't even realize that they are trafficking victims. The fact that somebody has taken their passport off them, they've not given them access to their bank account. They maybe don't even know how much they're being paid. The employer might think they're paying them the right wage, but somebody in between is taking money off them and leaving them with very little. We had a big case come through of traffic victims where they literally were having to wash in rivers because there was no natural running water in the home that they were in. A 3-bedroom house that there were over 30 people domiciled in. So from our perspective, as the teams go out and they build these bridges of trust, what they're looking to try and do is to get a window into a person's world, get to understand and walk a mile with them in that space. When a person is at that space of being willing to take a step out, we need to have everything in place. So we want to be able to, on our teams, we've got trauma therapists, clinical psychologists, people who can give them the right level of care. Alongside that, you want to have someone who's working with them around housing, access to support. But then the bit that we want to offer them as well is this: what has been done to you is wrong. And we need to be able to address this from a civil and criminal perspective. Some victims might go, I am done. I don't want to have anything more to do with this. But then you often get a victim who will take a stand. And when they're standing as a survivor, they'll go, I'll stand in the gap because I know there are other people who are in this place at this time. And even though it's an immense potential challenge and they're going through a crippling mental health journey through that whole process, they're willing to take a stand. And our team are trained in this space to be able to work on civil and criminal litigation for them. And we go after the traffickers, because there isn't any way that you're going to stop this unless the threat to trafficking, to traffickers, goes up. And so that you make it to the point where people think twice about wanting to do this. And sadly, there's been so few big trafficking cases prosecuted because the amount of extra work and support that there is in pulling a case together is huge, because you're starting originally, like I said, with a victim who is vulnerable. So their story is harder to gather together, and they might not have physical evidence. It might be this person, that place, and their story itself might tumble out of a conversation rather than them being in a place to be able to just say it initially. So the teams that we have are constantly trying to work through that. We're trying to also work in partnership and collaboration with other organizations who might have additional skills that might be relevant to us. We might have a child who comes through. I can think of one that came through that in the process of their trafficking ordeal, they'd had their mouth beaten, and the girl would not smile when the therapist was trying to work with them, wouldn't open up to them, until there was one moment where we realized that actually all of the teeth had been beaten out by the trafficker. So then we're paying for reconstructive surgery for the child, partnering with a great organization that can help support them in that space. So as I say, every case is unique, but we're trying to spot patterns and trends. We're trying to work across the board so that we would be able to have a thought through effective process. And then through monitoring and evaluation, what we're trying to work at is, of each of the outputs that we provide for these individuals, can we adjust any of them that would lead to better outcomes? So at the moment with children, we have a 95% success rate that those children will still be with their families when they're placed back up to 2 years afterwards. Now, that's only come about because the program has been going for so long, and we've gone, well, actually, if we understand more about the vulnerabilities of the family that exists, maybe there might be micro grants that we do to the family, or gifts that we do. I mean, we've done things like I've signed off buying chickens or bikes or sweets and things that families can use and utilize that create more stability, so that when the child goes back, there's less reason for them to either run away or for them to feel like they cannot stay. So the team work so effectively across all of our countries that we're in, but the fight is massive. And kind of there is a sense at the moment that the problem is getting worse. There are more people vulnerable because of war, because of famine, the effects of climate change, the impact that we're seeing across the world at this time is leading to a lot more people being vulnerable to potentially being trafficked. And therefore, we need to start to go further upstream, like your great-grandmother did, and start to address, based on what we know, how do we stop this from happening right at the beginning? And are there things that we can do from a geopolitical sense that would create barriers? So part of why we work with major multinational companies is we're saying, can we work together to address this, rather than throwing stones outside of an organization or putting them on the front page of a newspaper? Can we sit around a table and talk about what the essential issues are and come up with effective strategies to address this? And I know that's been incredibly effective. It continues to grow. And one of the things that's been pretty neat off the back of some of the companies that we've been working with is we've started to create working groups in key sectors to address the issues, so that they would collaborate together under our leadership, not to create an oligopoly against trade, but to effectively say that we're not all going to compete on human rights. We're all going to work together to address this. So, and they love it because if you have, yeah, if you, we've got one within the utilities sector, Utilities Against Slavery, and we have 23 of the world's largest utilities companies that are coming together. And by doing this, that maybe one of them might be 5% of somebody's supply, and it's really hard to get that supplier to change. But together, maybe they're 60 or 70% of someone's supply, so they will definitely listen. And that then can mean that we can start to see sectors move in this way. But we need to really think, I talk about it this way. I think you need to think about it in the way that the cathedral builders had in Europe. You know, the person who laid the founding stone, it was maybe 400 years at sometimes before the cathedral was completed. So you needed to come into it with the mindset that I am one person doing my role at this time to build the wall, but to the glory of God, a cathedral is going to be built and it's going to be effective for generations to come that I played a part in. But I need to be happy with the fact that I laid a stone. I wasn't the person who got to see it completed, but all of us together stand on the shoulders of the people who've come before us, like your great-grandmother's work and diligently working with governments. It only works if the next generation stands on her shoulders to enable more effective impact in the lives of people across the world and seeing human rights really brought to the fore.
Yeah. So super interesting going to the sort of roots of the environment out of which the trafficked people come. I mean, that just makes so much sense that, both in how you work with survivors, but also in how you bend the curve of the increase. But let's shift to a little bit more about what you were talking about of the system side. So you talked about, civil and criminal proceedings. You talk about working with large multinationals. I'm curious, for instance, whether the European Supply Chain Directive work has made a difference or not, and also on the policy side, as well as on the, supply chain side in the private sector. Yeah, just super. We'd love to hear sort of right now what are the best solutions that you think are offering a chance to bend that curve.
Yeah, so maybe if I go back a little bit and how the legislation has shifted in that space. Originally back in 2000, Arnold Schwarzenegger of the movie fame, when he was governor in California, he brought through the Transparency in Supply Chain Act. And it was the first time that businesses had to report on what they were doing about this issue. If they were over $100 million turnover, they had to have a statement on their website about what they were doing. And it was really very pioneering work. Theresa May, Lady May as she is now, when she was Home Secretary, so the person who looks after all policing in the UK, she brought forward the Modern Slavery Bill. And within that, it had a tiny piece of legislation under Section 54 of that bill required companies that had annual revenue above 36 million or more to have a statement in their financial accounts about what they were doing on this issue. Groundbreaking, never been done before. We saw the Human Rights Bill in Norway. We saw Modern Slavery Bill in Europe. We come through in France and then go on through into Transparency in Supply Chains Act in Germany and then on into Australia. And Australia was the first country to bring in actual penalties, financial penalties for companies. We've seen things step change whenever legislation changes. And the problem that you sometimes get is the companies push back and say, we don't want this legislation. This is extra burdens of hassle and stress that we're going to have to deal with. But when you speak to people at the top level, what they want is commonality of legislation so that the same things occur in every country, so that then you don't have a sense that a company operating in a different country can undermine the human rights aspect. So within the European Union of late, they brought through CSDDD, which is the Corporate Supply Chain Due Diligence Directive. We were really excited about this at first because it was groundbreaking in the proposals and what we thought was going to come through. We had at the beginning of this year a change to that through Omnibus. And what that did was it reduced it. It was going to be that you were going to have to be responsible for all of your supply chains globally. And initially the companies pushed back and said, we're not able to deal with kind of looking through our entire supply chain. Why should we be held to account for this? And there's amazing software packages and companies that are working on transparency in supply chain. Companies like Exeger, who now you can see right down to the factory level where products are coming through and performing really great work. Assessment there. They're one of a number of organizations, but leading the light in that area. With CSDDD having been reduced, it still has value, but it's just not as potent as it potentially was. And we've seen companies go so far and then pull back somewhat based on where that was. There has been some quite interesting legislation that came through under President Trump in his first term. He brought through the Uyghur Force Protection Act. And for those who've not heard before, in China, there is a region called the Uyghur region, where an ethnic group of Muslim, where there is 1.1 million individuals that are being held against their will and forced to work within the supply chains of many businesses. And one of the things that this act did, which was again groundbreaking, was that it brought a presumption of guilt to products coming from that area, that then companies would have to provide evidence that it hadn't been made through slave labor. And a key product in that for you to be aware of would be in solar panels. There is a component called polysilicate. So if you take silicon and dig it out of the ground, you heat that product to 1500 degrees Celsius, it produces polysilicate. And it's the essential component within solar panels. And it's part of the reason why, because the polysilicate is coming out of Xinjiang, it's why solar panels have become so cheap internationally. Because of the piece of legislation that President Trump brought through, and that presumption of guilt, $4.2 billion worth of solar panels have been banned from coming into the United States. We see off the back of it that those solar panels ended up on buildings in the UK and across Europe. Our hope is that as legislation changes, we would see a mirroring of legislation that sends signals to countries and companies that your products will not be tolerated anywhere in the world. The challenge that we see at the moment is, because we are behind the line and we see the products and we know what's happening, that legislation itself needs to have teeth. And our long-term hope is that legislation will bring CEO criminal liability with it as it goes forward, because we see how changes in legislation can drive behaviour. So an example from the UK would be the online harm bill that came through this last year. Now, we've talked about the dangers of pornography and how that becomes a grooming stage for children who then go on to sexually abuse individuals, and how pornography becomes an on-ramp in that space. When they brought in the legislation, and it now means that people have to have factors in to be able to put your credit card effectively on to validate what age you are, internet searches for pornography in the UK have dropped by 2/3, which tells us that mainly children have been accessing pornography in the UK. That bill, we would love to see that come forward in the US and have the same impact across the board, not to restrict people's human rights, but actually to put guardrails around protections around children in a way that enables them to not be exposed to the same problems and issues that come through. So we can see really great examples of what could happen. For me, I really believe that CEO criminal liability is important, because many companies are acting like serious and organized crime when they see it happen. I think as well as that, for me personally, I believe that no woman should be bought and sold. And therefore, I have a real pushback against anyone who does use women in that way, and primarily women, but not exclusively women in that way. So therefore, I would like to see further legislation that would come through to safeguard the individual themselves, rather than criminalize an individual in a brothel, maybe to start to look about the perpetrator themselves and hold the perpetrator to account. And there's some great examples of that in different European countries where work has been done to try and to highlight the potential challenge that a lady has in that space, where she's being forced from man to man, but then being treated as the criminal, rather than actually looking at who are the victims across the board. So as we start to see these examples come through, we want to see replication across the board. So like I mentioned in Texas, where foster care is a key thing, there's a bill at the moment going through Congress, which would provide an aging out of foster care. So instead of a cliff edge where people girls and boys hit 18 and then they've got no support, to try and help provide general support to get them into their own living place and a place of work, would be incredibly helpful, because for your own children at the age of 18, you're not going to just kick them out and expect them to fend for themselves. You'll try and
They're
set.
in their 30s and I'm
Yeah.
still helping them.
You want them to be able to be in stable living. You want to help them with the challenges that they face, and so that no one can come in and find them in a place of vulnerability. And that's the place that we have to have. We have to have people in strong communities, safe positions where they're not in a place of vulnerability. Because if we can close out the vulnerability, then you make it much more difficult for traffickers or those who are looking to enslave individuals to prey in those areas.
Wow. So let me ask you a question about the tech side of things, which I think is always, at least to me, it's sort of appealing. You can the long hard slog of the policy change and or bumpiness of how to get good legislation through. But on the tech side, you mentioned this very simple change where the law came with the tech to say just put your credit card in, like that's and the incredible impact. But I'm curious about sort of if you're the CEO who really is committed to this and has the same views as you do about women and forced labor, how do you tell down to the last factory? How do you tell down to the field of harvesting something that goes into the food we eat? And I'm partly curious about AI and whether that's shifting anything, but also, we've had a pretty big revolution just in traceability systems in terms of being able to. So, that's sort of one side is in the supply chains, but the more general question is, what's going on the tech side? And curious whether there's any breakthroughs that you see.
There's lots and lots of great products that are being developed at the moment in an array of different areas for tech-based solutions. I think you almost need to see where we're going to go, because if you see where we're going to go, then you start to understand how AI is going to help us and move in the future. My view would be that in the future, we're going to be able to scan the barcodes of products, and you're going to find out exactly the traceability of what was happening. So if in the UK, if you now want to come and buy tuna fish, and you buy a can of tuna fish, because of the laws, I can scan and tell you which fishing vessel that it was caught through. I can tell you whether it was pole or a net caught, and I can tell you the date when the tuna was caught and how it was processed. All of that information is available at a click of a button. I can't tell you, however, the conditions that the men, predominantly men, on those boats were kept in. I can't tell you how many hours they were at sea for, because we don't correlate that data. We don't keep it. We're not on top of it. So there is a need for us to work alongside systems that already exist at the moment and try and start to say, well, how can those systems do more? I think as we see AI go forward, we will see how victims being identified at border force, victims on planes, victims in train stations, major transit hubs. We would expect all of that data to be enabling a real shift in victim identification and making it harder for the traffickers to traffic victims across borders. But the problem that we still see is people have this view that trafficking happens to people away from where they live. The number one kind of ethnicity of individuals who were trafficked last year in the US are US nationals. They're not foreign nationals. And therefore, it starts to change the thought process that you have in terms of how do we address this. So as we see companies wanting to get involved, I've talked about Exeger's system at the moment, and there are other platforms that are looking to try and do the same. But they're gathering data at such a massive level so that you can take your bill of quantities for a product and you could put it into the system, and it can analyze in a heartbeat where all of those products are coming from, the complex shipment structure that they're having to go through, and down to the factory level. They can analyze the factory level. Who owns the factory? Are there any other human rights violations that person has been linked to? Because if you knew the owner of a factory where you were supplying goods from had a sister factory where there was a raid done and people were found to be enslaved, you'd want to know about that, because that might be something you want to look at. We see major multinational companies, and at the moment, even the biggest companies might only go and visit 200 factories a year, but they might be supplying from 200,000 factories. Data and the way AI and tech solutions can be used is that you pinpoint for those companies where they need to shine the greatest deal of light on. And some of that might be commodity based, some of that might be location based, or some of it might be down to the factory level itself. I know that when we start to ask difficult questions, you realize that there's significant work that needs to be done. And I think we also are realists. So we say that, we're not asking companies to boil the ocean. There is a sense that we want to be able to help them so that they can be strategically focused. So an example of that would be a bank that we have been speaking with, who in the UK want to pinpoint which are the branches that are more likely to be close to where modern day slavery happens, so that they can give elevated training rather than a computer-based training for an hour. Maybe they do a half-day training session for those individual branches that are most at risk. That wouldn't have been possible before, but now, because we can heat map, because we can profile, because we can work with amazing companies like Experian to help provide support for data and analytics, you start to have this sense of understanding more of the problem and pinpointing solutions. We're seeing technology solutions coming through because people can see real need and real application. And where those individuals who've built their tech fortune have come together, they're now starting to ask questions of, well, can I do something that produces a recurring income, but can I get it to solve a big problem? I'm not one of those people who don't think profit is good. I think profit for companies is good. They can do great things with it. But if a company is socially minded, they can use the tools and apparatus that they have to commercially make money to also be turned to affect this change. So looking at the issue of trafficking in hotels, considering how victims might be identified, looking at geo data on phones. Like there's a great company that's now secured a deal with Vodafone to produce chips that fit into phones that will ban pornographic material coming onto the phones. Now, for parents, how much more would they be willing to pay for their children to know that they're not going to have to just think about protocols, that this can be embedded within the phone itself? Now, I think that's amazing, and I want to almost celebrate Vodafone, celebrate what we want to replicate, celebrate companies who are willing to do something that makes them stand out in this area. Because all too often, there are so many companies that just turn a blind eye. They're not prepared to even consider this. So I think where we're just seeing at the moment the advent of AI, we've probably got the next 30 years, which will lead to some incredible breakthroughs. There's so many gifted people who are working in this area who are trying to think, if I pull at this thing, what will happen? What's the unintended consequence? And if I do that, is there a way that we can come up with a strategy that affects so much change at the same time and will make it much and much more difficult? Financial transaction data, the use of blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and our ability to see the flows of money will show major changes. And we're seeing a real advent for cryptocurrency coming through. Central bank digital currency will be coming through in the next 2 years. Ursula von der Leyen has said in Europe that will be brought forward because she can see dangers for countries potentially for transactions to come through if a business is able to bring a cryptocurrency to the market that is bigger and faster than a central bank, then it could erode tax revenues in those areas. So I think from what I'm seeing at the moment, even with China trialing, I think in 4 major cities, central bank digital currency, you're going to see that roll out in the next couple of years. And how can we be at the forefront of that, using that data to affect real change, so that whenever a bank puts through a suspicious activity report, that it's segmented and understand this is a trafficking case, this is something connected to modern day slavery. We highlight this because it's not just an odd transaction. We highlight this because we think this could be directly linked to what's going on. So I think for me, technology could be the X factor that adds to the impact that we're making. It needs to be, because there just are not the organizations scaled to the level that can affect change at the level we need to address the 50 million. Maybe technology gives those organizations like Hope for Justice the ability to magnify what we're doing. But I would want to say there are some incredible organizations working in this field, desperately wanting to try and help and trying to go through the difficult days of helping organizations like us help find people.
Yeah. One of the things I love about talking to you is in your organization's name, it's hope. Like you're just continue to give sort of this is what's happening, this is what could happen, which is just, it's really incredible for such an intractable problem that you can go that specific and really pull out these examples of where things are shifting. So it's
Hope,
just fabulous
hope
to.
is a powerful thing, though. It's the bit that gets you up in the morning. It's the light at the end of the tunnel. It's the optimism that we have to have to see things in. And I believe that we should be merchants of hope, dispensing hope in every place that we come. And kind of be custodians of hope, that you can enter someone's world and drop a bit more hope into them, that things will be better, that tomorrow, because the 24-hour news cycles of pain and desperation that are out there, somehow they pull us all down to a low level where we all assume that tomorrow is going to be worse than it has been today. And I'm more of an optimist from that perspective, but I'm certainly this view of, if you engage someone and you come into their world, maybe we can bring hope as a tsunami that goes out and starts to envelop everyone with this kind of sense that, why can't we live in a world where this doesn't exist? Like, why? Because at the minute there are weak, marginalized, poor, and oppressed people who are being enslaved all over the world. Why couldn't we be the generation to see an end to this? Put the legislation in place, invoke the legislation, ensure that it's enforced by the political powers through the police forces in those areas, but also ensure that the average person who's a consumer doesn't ever buy or sell a product or a person, that has been informed and involved in slavery. I definitely believe that at this moment in time, and that's why I see hope as almost like a river that we're in, that kind of is unstoppable.
I love it. So tell me a little bit about yourself. What's been the arc of your career, or your personal life that's landed you in this space? Would love to hear.
Yeah, well, so I grew up in an unusual family in that my mum was principal private secretary to the head of the Northern Ireland office at the time of the Troubles. So if you imagine the person who's overall responsible for looking after the Northern Ireland location for the British government, my mum is his assistant, and so consequently we grew up and had a car bomb planted outside of the home, and various things that people would probably not ever want to see. And I had the privilege of traveling when I was quite young. My parents allowed me to go to Australia on my own, and then on to the following year to Venezuela, Guyana, and Brazil, and got to see a bit of the world and how people lived. And coming from quite a rural location, it gave me a view that I wanted to do something significant in the world. And I almost convinced myself that I wanted to be a stockbroker. And I had because I thought those guys earn loads of money, and maybe we could get loads of money and then do some good with the money that was coming. So I decided to go to university and study technology. And when I was at university, I got plugged into a church, and we were doing some great work in the local community, and I got offers to go stockbroking potentially in London or New York, and decided to turn those down. I worked part-time while I was at university for a bank, and I went and became a bank manager, then a senior manager. And again, from that place of being involved in the church and wanting to do something significant, one of my previous bank clients had contacted me and said, look, they were looking to set up a couple of $100 million in a high-tech offshore investment trust, and could I give a couple of weeks to travel around America and see if we could invest in businesses. And when I was on one of those trips at the end of 2007, I went out for dinner on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles with a friend who worked for a children's charity, and he brought an individual who would change my life. And when I asked this chap who was with him what he did for a job, he told me he worked as a slave hunter. And I'd never heard of anything like it. It wasn't a world that I'd ever engaged with before. And he was on the phone to Condoleezza Rice, who was working for the Bush administration. And he was arguing about the downgrading of India on the human trafficking register. He'd been in Mumbai the week before and seen girls in cages that were being shipped all over India. And I couldn't believe it. And he pulled out his digital camera after he came off the phone, back in the days when we didn't have cameras on our phones, and showed me images of girls that had been taken and kind of covertly taken in India. And he said to me, this is going on all over the world. It's going on in the UK. It might even be going on in your city. He said, I guarantee you there'll be kids crying themselves to sleep and just praying for someone to come and help. And I couldn't shake it. I came back to the UK, and my wife was heavily pregnant with our first child. We'd bought a piece of land. We were building a house. It was like the most inconvenient time you could ever imagine. And a friend of mine, Chris, who had run a car dealership network in the UK, had met 4 people in Manchester And they'd come up with the principal idea that maybe we could put on an event. And Chris said to them, well, why don't we all do this together? And at the end of 2007, we gathered together. In the April, we founded Hope for Justice as a charity. I got to name the organization. I sat on the founding board and then came on 2011. We were looking at doing a couple of charities merging in, and then took over 5 years ago running the charity. So kind of been on that whole roller coaster. I feel like we're 17 years in now, and we're making a significant impact through all of our staff and team, but kind of feel the enormity of the challenge. So I'm someone, because of my background, I'll think strategically, I'll try and work collaboratively, but I'm also in a place where I need to be the person who asks us to go further, and the bar being higher, and that we need to do more. But kind of outside of that, I'm married, I have 4 children, and kind of I'm blessed in so many aspects of my life, but feel that this is something that is so significant that we all need to be involved in. And I'm reminded of, I went over to Northern Ireland, and we've had 7 organisations merged into Hope for Justice to give us scale. And I went over to visit a place called Clifton House in Northern Ireland, which was set up by the wealthy individuals of Belfast predominantly for children back at the end of the 1700s in terms of their help and support. And as we were walking around that place, because we were doing some filming, one of the guides had showed us a bust of a lady called Mary Ann McCracken, and I'd never heard of her before. And she isn't someone of international fame, but Mary Ann grew up at the end of the 1700s before any rights for women. And she led a movement of women that abstained from having sugar in their diet in Belfast because of the transatlantic slave trade. And so much so that they say that the sugar sales collapsed in Belfast as a result. And she then, with a couple of other men, led a movement for Belfast to be the first slave port to stop slave ships from docking. And why that was really important was at the height of the transatlantic slave trade, Belfast, the wealthiest person in New York from the transatlantic slave trade was from Belfast. And it was said that after Abraham Lincoln passed the Abolition Act, that she stood on the seashore for any of the Irish people who were emigrating to America, and there were lots that were about to board boats. She would literally rugby tackle them in her 60s and ensure that they would go and see their senator in whatever state they would go into to ensure that the Abolition Act had been fully invoked. And I kind of think, for a lady who, like, she isn't the William Wilberforce's name up in lights about what she's done for human rights, but she represents a body of people who've not cared who gets the credit, but genuinely just care about making a difference in their generation. And I kind of, it's a spirit that gets on you, that you kind of go, could I be part of a movement of people that through generation to generation stand up and account for making a difference in this area? And so I often think back to that, because I think she wasn't bothered about the fame. She wasn't bothered about, being known, but I'm bothered about her because she's someone who motivates me to want to do more and not to seek any credit, and try and see if we can do a little bit of what she's done in terms of calling people to get off their blessed assurance and do something, and reach out and help some people who need help.
Sometimes I ask, I think you've actually probably just answered this question, but I sometimes ask this question of, when you're in kinds of environments, dealing with the survivors, dealing with the intransigence of, companies or policymakers, how do you, what gets you up in the morning? How do you how do you hold on to that hope?
I think it's difficult for anybody who's in a space where they're dealing with vulnerable people, because the ability to work in a space and not be either overwhelmed, fatigued, or like compassion overload, where you just feel like you can't feel anything. Sometimes it's not the worst cases that are the ones that motivate you or that capture you. It's the ones that are close to home. My daughter a few years ago was 8 years old, and I took her in at bed at night. And I know lots of parents do that. We do prayers and we talk, we're past those days now, but at the time it was lovely. And we had a case through our Cambodian program at the time. And a girl, we talk with every victim about what they're grateful for, because the power of gratitude is something that takes you away from a focus on what you're doing to a focus on the future. And a little 8-year-old girl who'd been passed from man to man, forced to service man after man, said that she was grateful she got to sleep in a dry bed. For me, past the age where kids wet the bed and everything, and parents would know all about that, but you should never have to be an 8-year-old kid that ends up sleeping in a wet bed, to have to go through horrendous things. And sometimes it's those bits that just capture you and keep you going. And sometimes all you have is the ability to just keep going. I mean, I'm reminded of all the time people try and tell us what we're doing is impossible. And there's a famous quote by Muhammad Ali who said that impossible is just a big word thrown around by small-minded men who find it easier to live in a world they've been given than the power they have to change it. That impossible is nothing, impossible is temporary, impossible is a dare. And there's a part in that empowers people to dare to believe that which they've seen as a wall could end up being a bridge. And I think there's something in me, but partly maybe the way that I grew up and having to live in a world which wasn't desirable. None of us who grew up at that time in Northern Ireland wanted to see explosions and people being shot dead and kind of difficult things to wrestle with whenever you're children. But when you're faced with the inequalities in the world and you're really faced with the motivation, I think for me as a Christian, I'm motivated by wanting to make a difference and embody all that I possibly can in the world that would do great. And knowing at the same time, I'm a flawed individual. I probably still say, do and think the wrong things, but just knowing if I can do the best that I can do with what I have available to me, it's almost like a daily decision to give everyone your best minute, to be focused as best you possibly can. And also know that there are tensions within all of this, because I have the tension of having a family whilst being away, trying to run an amazing organization, but still, how do you do that with the resources and trying to maximize the resources you have, paying people well, but also not doing enough and feeling those tensions. And some things are problems to be solved and some things are tensions to be managed. And quite often you live in a world which has so many tensions to be managed that sometimes it can leave you diluted rather than concentrated. And it's that piece every morning to be able to intentionally get up to go, well, today, just for today, what can I do that's going to make a difference? And every day is going to be different, but what can I pour into people? What can I do? What can I say that will affect change at whatever level that will leave the world a bit of a better place?
There's something very Rooseveltian about the Muhammad Ali quote of, like, let's imagine the world we want for the next generations and let's do what we can. So I really love that. What are you reading now? I like to ask people. Books are a huge part of my life, and I'm always curious. What's either on your to be read shelf, which you haven't gotten to possibly because you're flying around and very busy with your family and your work, or what's something that has really sort of changed the way you think.
Well, I always have a number of books on the go at any one time, and anybody knows me that I know I've always got a ton more that I'd like to be getting to, but I just don't have the time. And sometimes whenever I get on planes, it's the only time where people can't call you that you've got your own thought process. So I sometimes feel that tension between I could be reading a book now, or I could be just sitting and thinking about a concept and where we are. So I have a number of things that I'm thinking of reading through at the moment on the shelf. I can reach for them, but I got given a great book by a guy called Kevin Malone, who's been appointed into Health and Human Services, called Scouting the Enemy: From Running Major League Baseball Teams to Ending Child Sex Trafficking. So that one is on my desk at the moment. There's a great guy who has created a book called How to Lead Nonprofits, and it's by a guy called Nick Grono from the Freedom Foundation, someone who for the last decade has been working on the best way to lead nonprofits. That's kind of the business minded. I am a big John Grisham fan. So, I'll be open and say that I've been and visited most of the places that are mentioned in the books. So from a novel perspective, I just find him to be a great author and someone who's engaging. So hopefully from there, you've got a little bit more towards the demonstration I read quite variedly. So I've got, a bit about trafficking, a bit about how to do my job better. And then also that little bit on the side of kind of enjoying a bit of fiction and kind of on that basis.
Well, it's just been a true pleasure talking to you today, Tim. Thank you so much. Just hearing about your journey and the incredible work that Hope for Justice is doing. I just one last question in closing. we're in turbulent times. Things are changing. The word unprecedented is in every other headline. I'm just curious, and I know you have a sort of generational perspective of where we're doing our bit, we're building. But if you bring that back a little bit to your lifetime, to what you can accomplish, what are you hoping for in the next years?
In the next years, gosh, I think for me within the organization, I don't just want to play at this. And if we don't do something significant to affect this change, I will feel that I've not done my job properly. So my hope is that we'll start to turn the tide in terms of convincing politicians to do more. And that's difficult because everything that's out there is appealing for politicians to do less, or for is competing for politicians' time. So it makes it very difficult. But I would say my hope is that we can be an effective organization, that we can be thought leaders in the space, and we can help other organizations with effective solutions and tools that we can put on the place. Where at the minute we're working on survivor care standards that we're going to be launching in Uganda with the Ugandan government and Nottingham Rights Lab out of Nottingham University. My hope is that that will start to create a model for not just Uganda, but also for Africa in terms of where that sits. We're working in the UK on a victim advocate program for independent modern slavery advocates. We've currently got 98 organisations that are signed up to that, and we're on a 4-year build out of what that will be to create a national strategy for independent victim advocates. We call them IMSAs, Independent Modern Slavery Advocates. So IMSA strategy nationally, that's a 4-year plan. So, I've got to see the end of that. I think there's going to be a lot of consolidation long term within the charity sector because of the challenging, turbulent time that we see. My hope is that actually it leads to better organisations that are better funded, less organisations, better funded, more effective in where they are, whether it's in the modern slavery field or beyond. I have a hope that we can do things on an international scale. We co-created the tools for the World Economic Forum on this issue. For me, hopefully that is a starter for where we might see a redefinition of the Palermo Protocol and get more governments on board. I probably could give you a shopping list of things that I want to see happen. But again, being an optimist, I probably have that shopping list so big that I can only be disappointed. I think it was Warren Buffett who said that the wife you should choose should be somebody who has low expectations, and then you'll always be pleased. I think for me as a CEO, you kind of always have high expectations, and you can only be disappointed. But kind of from that perspective, yeah, I hope to not get in the way and hinder the movement in any way, but just to be a part of seeing it amplify and make a bigger difference.
Well, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time as well, and thanks for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Oh, no, we're just so delighted to throw a spotlight on your organization and your work and really honor you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that.